So how did the teachings of Jesus get lost? Aren't they in the Bible? Yes, they're in the New Testament epistles and the Gospels, and they're also preserved in the Aramaic core of the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. But they were written down 40 to 80 years, 2 to 4 generations after the crucifixion in the case of all the Christian literature, and they were mistranslated into Koine Greek from the earlier Aramaic and Hebrew sources. The Gentile or non-Jewish church writers misunderstood the references in the sayings and parables of Yeshua. Paul, whose authentic epistles were written between 50 and 60 A.D., and the gospel writers, the early of which was Mark, perhaps at about the same time as Paul, all the way to about 100 A.D. with John's gospel, they spun the sayings and the parables, that is, they redacted them and edited them to support their own theological agendas. The earliest authentic sources, which are the Q source and the Thomas core, which were written down about 30 to 50 A.D., were lost in their original forms, but they have been recovered by scholarship. So modern biblical scholarship has the tools to recover the historical pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. Now, Yeshua's teachings were not transmitted in Christianity. Christianity is based on teachings about Yeshua as being the Lord, as being the Christ, the Redeemer, God who was sacrificed on the cross. Yeshua's message had nothing to do with a sacrifice on the cross. He did not teach salvation by belief in creeds. He taught liberation by your works. It was your works that liberated you, and your faith meant fidelity, faithfulness. Now, Christianity, as we know it, emerged a generation after the execution of Yeshua by the Romans. The epistles and gospels were written 2 to 4 generations after the crucifixion of Yeshua, and in a foreign language. And they were written for specific purposes, for people who were not Jews, in fact, people who were in quite serious conflict with the original Jewish Christians. And the Aramaic words and parables of Yeshua were misunderstood in Greek, and they were spun to reflect emerging Christian doctrines about Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, and so on. So we see, as we go from Hebrew to Greek, we have not only wide cultural gulf, and we have now a split or a schism between the original Jewish Christians who knew and understood the teachings of Yeshua, and many of whom had studied with him and been with him, and the Gentile Christians whose religion was now based on some very different kinds of premises. And the historical teachings of Yeshua were replaced by Christian theological doctrines. And they focused mostly on the idea of his sacrificial death on the cross. His teachings were preserved, and they were transmitted, but not with the same understanding that they were given. They were transmitted very often to make points, very often anti-Semitic points against the Jews. It was no longer just the small number of wealthy people in the temple establishment that crucified Yeshua and against whom he had many times prophesied, but it was all the Jews. All the Jews had rejected their Messiah, and all the Jews had lost their covenant, and the covenant was now was taken over now by the Gentile Christians. Now, why am I calling Jesus Yeshua? Well, the name Jesus originated about 200 years ago in England. His real name was Yeshua. If you called out Jesus to him and his disciples back in the days when they were walking the earth, they wouldn't have even turned around. They wouldn't know who you were talking about. Yeshua is his historical Aramaic and Hebrew name, and that's how he was known to everyone. And I use the name to indicate that I'm talking about the real Jesus of history rather than the legendary Lord Jesus of early Christianity. Now the word Yeshua is from a triliteral root that means liberation in Hebrew and in Aramaic. It's represented by the English name Joshua and Jehoshua in the Bible, but in order to distinguish Yeshua from the other Yeshuas, in the King James, they always translated Jesus' name as Jesus and the rest as Joshua. His historical title was probably Mar, which is an Aramaic term meaning spiritual master. It was probably not Rab or Rabbi or Rabbi. The Greek New Testament uses Rav and Rab and Rabboni, but he was probably not called by those terms. He was known as Mar Yeshua, the Master Yeshua. Now, the Gentile name for Yeshua that we find in the New Testament is Jesus. We find Paul using him, and that becomes the name that's used in the first century because Christianity became Gentile, non-Jewish, and spoke an entirely different language, Greek. So the New Testament uses Greek Jesus, and that continues to be the usage in the Greek Orthodox Church. In these presentations, I'll refer to Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus, Yeshua, Jesus, and the Master. When I use the name Yeshua, I refer to the historical person. When I use the name Jesus, I refer to the legendary and non-historical Jesus Christ of Christianity and the New Testament.